Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Todd Metcalf. We're filming from this year's 2023 Global Tax Symposium, and we're very pleased and very fortunate to have with us this morning Chairman Dave Camp. Chairman Camp, thank you for taking the time.
Well, thanks, Todd. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Um, as I mentioned, we're here at PwC's Global Tax Symposium, and you just came off the stage where you were able to interview one of your successors, the current chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, who has been in that position almost a year. I think he mentioned perhaps longer than former chairman and former Speaker Paul Ryan. So he set a record that he's proud of. I'd like to get your thoughts on a few things, but I want to start with the question on all of our minds. What are the prospects as you see it for a year-end tax bill?
Well, Chairman Smith was really forthcoming on his agenda and how he saw things sort of panning out for the rest of the year. And it doesn't look as if there's going to be a tax bill this year. I mean, you never want to say never in politics because there could be something that came forward. But hearing from him, it really seemed as if it's going to be next year. I think he thinks they have a number of vehicles they could attach the bill to. He thinks they're very close on the negotiations. But I think there's just a lot of other things in place. And as he said, it would have to happen next week in order for that to take place. And I just think the calendar has run out of time. And I was on the Hill yesterday, and the members are actually looking forward to going home and having a Christmas for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, they're smelling those jet fumes that we're all very famous with, we all know about rather. So you had a very extensive conversation with him. Talked a lot about like how he thinks about issues, how he's approached the agenda for the committee, and how he plans to approach the agenda going forward. So what are your principal takeaways from that conversation?
Well, it was important that he's held these hearings all around the country, field hearings as they call them, and he really has taken his policy measures from those hearings and incorporated them into a piece of legislation. And I think that is going to continue to be the way he moves legislation and really finds out what he needs to really focus on. But he's really also preparing for 2025 when the TCJA provisions expire. And he really has an extensive plan of policy discussions with the committee, meetings with other members of Congress to really try to educate them and bring them up to speed, and also determine what are the areas they're going to focus on. And as he said, pretty much everything is going to be on the table. He's not going to just tweak the TCJA, but he's going to look at other taxation systems, I'm not saying that they'll adopt them, but whether that's a destination-based cash flow tax or whether that's a carbon tax. But he said they're going to look at it all. And so I think it's going to be a really busy 2024, very important year for businesses to be engaged because they want to be part of the solution and part of shaping that message and highlighting what are those key provisions and what they mean for their companies, for their workers and their families. And I think it's going to be an exciting year from a policy standpoint, but a very much, homework year.
Right, exactly. As we all know from our time on the Hill, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And,
Exactly.
and taxpayers don't want to be on the menu, at least not without some input into what that dish looks like.
Well, and exactly. And he even mentioned there could be some pay-fors for these 3 business provisions that are trying to be extended. And obviously, he was very aware of how much it would cost to just reinstate what is on the provisions in the TCJA, over $3.5 trillion. So the financing part of that is going to be a very, very critical.
Exactly. So another issue that has come up repeatedly during this year's Global Tax Symposium is obviously the OECD's Pillar Project. And Chairman Smith had, I think it's fair to say, a firm view on Pillar 2, and he talked a little bit about his meetings with OECD counterparts, with some European counterparts, to sort of express the position of at least House and Senate Republicans, certainly on Pillar 2. What are your thoughts on how he's approaching Pillar 2 or the Pillar Project generally?
Well, it's interesting because he's traveled a fair amount for that. And in order to impact something internationally, you actually do have to travel. So it's important that he's done that. I think he's delivered the message. And I think to some extent the message was heard at the OECD because there were some minor changes, obviously, with regard to R&D, sort of a safe harbor for a period. So I don't think he's letting go of those issues. And although it's really difficult for the House to negotiate these provisions, it's really up to the administration And he did say he thought they could be getting more assistance from the administration than they're receiving. But I don't see anything in the Congress happening on that until after the election. And he did say that all of this tax policy is going to really depend on the outcome of the election. And as he said, I mean, you don't know who your partner is, you don't know who you're negotiating with, and so who becomes president, who is in the majority in the Senate, who's in the majority in the House, will absolutely be, mission critical for tax policy going forward.
Exactly. So, finally, I have a question just generally. I mean, obviously, we've seen negotiations that were successful, we've seen negotiations fall apart, and generally it's because there's some significant gap between what one side wants and the other side is unwilling to give. But in this situation that we're looking at right now, there is a broad bipartisan consensus on fixing the R&E expense issue, the interest expense issue, bonus depreciation. And from my perspective, I thought it was very helpful and hopeful. Chairman Smith seemed to embrace the child tax credit, which Democrats have said that's what we need. So in a situation where there's this sort of broad consensus or seeming consensus on all of the issues that are on the table, what is the hurdle? Why can they not get it across the finish line?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it took some time to negotiate that. And as he said, he has a good relationship with Senator Wyden, chairman of the Finance Committee, which is really helpful to this issue and others as they're going to be coming down the road in the next year or two. I think there's just been so much complexity on the dynamics in the Congress and particularly in the House. And this idea of how are these going to be paid for, or should they be paid for? And then the time is really being taken up by other side issues. Not they're not really side, they're important issues like funding the government, the supplemental for Ukraine and for Israel, and other items that I think are just kind of taking the space away from their ability to get this done. And I think, as we've said before, until they know exactly what this is going to be attached to, you don't put a tax bill out there just to let it age, because they don't age well.
Exactly.
And so he said there are many. I was encouraged, though, that he said there were many alternatives for this to be the vehicle for these three business provisions, but he didn't really identify one, and I wouldn't have expected him to, but that has to be determined, and that negotiation is actually more difficult than it might seem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Chairman Camp,
Thanks,
for
Todd.
joining us. Thank you for joining us on Policy on Demand, and stay tuned for more.